I am Dr. Elizabeth Barrett. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I'm grateful to be asked by Algoma Family Services to do this presentation this morning. The topic is on grandparents raising grandchildren, and I think we're seeing this in increasing numbers all over the world, actually. And I'm really just going to talk just in general about what it means by grandparents raising grandchildren, and then discuss some of the benefits. But I'd like to focus on some of the challenges. And some of that has to do with the emotional responses that can be expected both in grandparents and in grandchildren. We're going to talk a little bit about helping yourself and your grandchild, transitioning to your home, maintaining relations with your grandchild's parent as best as that's possible, recommendations for visits with parents, and talking to your grandchildren about their parents. First of all, really what I'm focusing on in this talk is when grandparents assume a caregiving role of their grandchild. And I'm going to be talking primarily about when the grandparent is the primary caregiver. And in, when I was reviewing, looking at studies and things regarding this topic, sometimes they call families where the grandparent's a primary caregiver grandfamilies. Sometimes grandparent-headed families. Some people call it skip generation families. I kind of like the grand families. And when I'm talking today, I had to kind of figure out a way, because we're talking about a grandparent has a child who's the parent of their grandchild. So when I use the word parent, what that's going to mean is the parent of your grandchild. And when I use the word child, what I'm going to mean as a grandparent, that's your own adult child who is also the parent of your grandchild. That sounds like a lot of a mouthful there, but I just wanted to clarify that. And there are different configurations of how a grandparent becomes a primary caregiver. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's long-term, and sometimes it's permanent. And the first category, I'm not really talking about too much. They call that co-parenting, where the grandparent is in sort of a helping role with the grandchild's parent, and they can be living with that family or living separately. But when you have the place where, or the condition where the grandparent is really the primary caregiver of the grandchildren, that's called a custodial grandparent. And that can have either a legal status or an informal status. So if someone has signed legal papers to adopt, that's legal status, and the other is informal status, where it's actually can be a bit of a problem with regard to rights and things like that. But I'm not really going to get into that today, but that certainly is another full topic. Now, the purpose of this slide is really just to show that there are many reasons why a grandparent may take on this role of primary caregiver. And all of these situations have the potential to be traumatic for the grandchild and also for the grandparents. So if you're looking at things like divorce, adult parent drug or alcohol abuse, or mental or physical illness, child abuse or neglect, teen pregnancy, parental incarceration, death of a parent, these are all things that can be very traumatic. So we're going to expect that there's going to be emotional reactions in everybody involved. So the other thing is that sometimes the parent is actually completely absent from the life of the grandchild, but sometimes they can be there, but what we call psychologically absent. They're in the same town, but they're not, or even having visits, but they're not really there for the child. And the strength of the parent-grandchild relationship is related to the well-being of the parent. So if the parent is well, that means that it's more likely that their relationship with their child is going to be stronger. I'm going to just talk very briefly about benefits. Not that I want to belittle the benefits of this situation, because there are many, but I really wanted to focus on the challenges. But of course, for your grandchild, there's a lot of benefits having a grandparent raising them, because your grandchild knows you, and you know the family, and you know your grandchild, and you know the story. You've had experience nurturing your grandchild. And sometimes you're at the stage in your life where you're not working, or you're working part-time, and you have maybe more time for your grandchild. And of course, there's as you get older, you have more wisdom and experience. So those are all positives for your grandchild. they've looked at studies where they compared, okay, so I'm using some terminology here, kinship. So kinship care is when a child gets taken into care by a family that's a relative. So when you look at children that are put in a relative's home as opposed to non-relative's home, the placement of the child in that home is much more stable. The child adapts better. And in situations where it's a temporary care, for instance, if the parent has to go away and get some care and come back and resume care of their child, it's more likely to be a successful return to the parental home. So we do know that having a relative looking after you is definitely better for the child. Now, there are also positives for you, and there's many of those. I think knowing that your grandchild is safe, that you are able to connect with them in their world, and the joy you can experience in contributing to their development and well-being. It can provide a lot of meaning and purpose in your life and enhance your self-worth. It's companionship, and it keeps you young. So there's a lot of positives to this situation. So again, not to belittle these positives, I'm going to spend more time on the not so positive parts of the situation. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to focus on is this idea that people find it unacceptable to have negative feelings about these kinds of situations. And I call it the elephant in the room because it's something that is there, but we don't talk about it. So it is absolutely normal and expected to have these kinds of somewhat strong negative feelings in both grandparents and grandchildren. And I've kind of grouped them into 5 groupings, and that would be anger and resentment, grief and sadness, fears and worry, confusion, and guilt and shame. They've done studies where they talk to grandparents who are looking after their grandchildren, and they've kind of found that these are some of the core groups of symptoms that people have. And you'll notice it's actually the range of most of our human emotions. So as the grandparent who's put in the situation, you may have some anger and resentment of your child for putting you in this situation, the chaos that they bring, but also you might be angry at yourself. There can be a lot of baggage that you carry if you've raised your grandchild's parent and they have some problems. And it's not to say that any of us are to blame in those situations, but it's human nature that we might blame ourselves. And so there's a lot of that comes with this. And of course, there's all the other stuff that goes along with it, that you've got this increased responsibility, a financial burden. Your other family members may not approve of you making this decision. We can see that. Your partner might not be on the same wavelength as you about things. Your friends I put your friends who have a life because they may have a life that's quite different from yours with a lot more freedom. And also you can absolutely get anger and resentment towards the agencies that are involved. Because it can be quite intrusive having these people in your life and checking up on how you're doing as a parent, especially after you've already raised kids. And yes, you can have some anger and resentment towards your grandchild, and that's perfectly natural. You can have feelings, it's what we do with them. That's the issue. The other thing that they talk a lot about when they look, interview grandparents and stuff, is there absolutely is a lot of grief and sadness because you have many, many losses rather. So one of the biggest losses is that you are losing your role as grandparent to your grandchild because now you have to be a parent. And that's a very different thing, being a grandparent compared to a parent. And your other grandchildren may actually resent that. If they're not being cared by you, they can resent that. Your role as a parent to your own child is also going to be affected by this because of the situation that you're in. And also the siblings of your child, who's the parent of your grandchild, they can also have a lot of resentment, and it also changes your whole how you interact with your whole family. Also, your hopes and dreams for your child's life it's a loss because you see that they are not able to parent their child right now. And of course, some of the things I already spoke about, you've lost you might lose your friendships, your freedom, your privacy. You might lose your job, your retirement plans. So there's a lot of losses there. Now, there's also a lot of fears and worries. And I call those the what ifs, because when we have a lot of worries, our brain kind of frames it as what if this happens? So what if I can't manage this level of responsibility at this stage in my life? You know, do I have enough energy? Will my health be affected? What would happen if I die? What will happen to my grandchild? And one of the other areas that can be quite difficult is, you know, what if I accept help from an agency and they think because I'm accepting help, it means I'm not capable of caring for my grandchild? That can be a really big worry. What if I allow my grandchild to visit with their parent and they want to live with their parent again? Or what if it harms my grandchild emotionally? What if my child asks for custody of my grandchild and we get into a dispute about that? And one of the things I wanted to say as well that I have seen, and this is something people don't like to talk about, but sometimes you'll see some behaviors in your grandchild that make you worried they're going to turn out like their parent. And so that can be in the back of your mind when you're dealing with some of the behaviors of your grandchild. It's hard to know the answers to all of these things. Your legal rights and your legal status, the same, your child's legal status and rights, including visitation, your grandchild's rights, including contact with their parent, what information to share with your grandchild, questions about financial responsibilities, the confusion about that role going from grandparent to parent. Parenting is different nowadays and expectations for kids are different, and kids act different in this generation. And that can be a struggle when it's, you know, you're removed by that whole generation. And particularly when it comes to things like the new technology and the way schools have changed. I mean, I know myself with my own kids, I didn't understand how they were multiplying and dividing because that's not how we learned it. And this is like another extra generation skipped. And technology, yes, I had a lot of trouble with technology this morning, so I can completely relate to that. So, and the last part I want to talk about is this idea that, of course, you have a lot of guilt. And guilt is when you feel remorse for something that you've done in the past, and something you feel that maybe went against your morals or values. Shame is even deeper than guilt. Shame is when we feel that we are really, really a bad person inside, and we really messed up. And of course, this happened because I messed up. And shame is a much deeper, deep issue, because it brings out all kinds of feelings that you might not even be aware of. So you can feel guilty about your past parenting of your child and the situation they're in now. You might have some guilt about the way that you're parenting your grandchild because, you know, grandparents have a way of, you know, you spoil your grandkids more, you have a different way of being, and now you're in a whole new role. And that can be really difficult, and people can call you out for it. There's also a tremendous stigma. It depends on what culture you're in, but I would say that there is a stigma when grandparents are raising their grandchildren, because there's always that unanswered question of what happened to the parent. And there is absolutely a stigma involved in that. There shouldn't be, but there absolutely is. And so it can be really hard to go and seek outside help. Sometimes if you have a lot of shame, you don't feel like you deserve outside help, or because of the stigma of receiving support, it can feel weak when you need to ask for support. So there's a lot of grandparents talk about that struggle to overcome that sort of stigma and the feelings of shame to go and ask for help. And it's particularly painful if, as a grandparent, you have to make that agonizing decision that you're unable to continue to care for your grandchild, or unable to care for them in the first place. That is such a tremendously difficult decision to make, and can fill you with all kinds of feelings of guilt and shame. So I think that all of you can probably relate to what I'm talking about. And I'm not saying that people would have every one of these feelings. I'm saying that any of these feelings are possible, and it's okay. Now, before we talk about your grandchild's emotional reactions, I just want to do a little brief talk about how our brains are wired to respond when we don't feel safe, and how this might this whole system in our brain might affect your grandchild when they're put in this situation of being removed from the care of their parent. There's a system in the part of our brain that we call the amygdala, and we are born with that system because you need a system to keep you safe and alive. You need a system to detect life-threatening dangers in the environment that can threaten our survival. So it's a biological need to have this in our brain. And the way that this works is that when danger is detected in the environment, within not even a split second, it's an instantaneous red alert goes off in your brain. And that makes you have automatic behaviors that you don't even have to think about. That's what I mean by unconscious. So you don't even think about it, and you go into these types of behaviors to keep you safe. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, but the categories of behaviors that you go into are fight, flight, or freeze. In order to save time that would be required to think things over, the system bypasses the part of your brain that does the thinking and problem solving and goes directly to the part of the brain that controls these behaviors. So the important thing to remember is that because it's bypassing that part of the brain, these behaviors are not planned out and they're not on purpose. These can be difficult behaviors to deal with, but this is the brain's telling you you're in danger and you have to do something about it. So the categories of behavior that you get in response to that red alert in your brain would be either to stay and fight off the threat physically. You know, back in the days when we lived in the wild as human beings, you know, you would, if you saw a bear, you would have to stay and fight it off, or you would go into flight, which is running away to avoid the threat. Also, there's another category where you freeze, and you sometimes will see that in animals, like perhaps like a bunny rabbit. Like they'll freeze on the spot to blend into the background to avoid being seen as a way of protecting themselves. So this is a bit of a complicated slide I'm presenting here, and I think I'm trying to explain sort of how nature guarantees that we can keep infants safe. So when a newborn comes into the world, they're absolutely helpless and they can't care for themselves at all. And that's where human beings are different from other animals, because we have a much longer period of helplessness in our young. So it is essential for the newborn to survive that they have to form an attachment to an adult that can keep them safe and respond to their needs, because otherwise they would not survive. So the first adult or adults, it can be more than one, you know, I don't want to just say that it's mother, it can be mother and father, but the first adults, it could be a grandparent as well. The first adults to care for a newborn become what we call the primary attachment figure. That's the one, you know, the infant develops this idea in the brain that that's the person who you have an attachment bond with. And that's really the basis of that sort of strong love bond that we have. We're made to have that strong love bond to keep us safe. But this sort of system has to be connected to that danger detection system that I just spoke about. And the reason for that is that if an infant was abandoned, it would threaten the baby's survival. So you need to have that tied in to the attachment system, so that if a child is removed from the care of their primary attachment figure, the brain will perceive this as a threat to survival. And that can put the brain, I talked about it going on red alert. And, you know, that's like if you have an immediate danger in your environment that makes you feel threatened, you go on red alert. But this would mean the red alert is going to be on for much longer. And because there's a perception, the brain's perceiving that this is an unsafe situation. So these children who are in this state are more likely to go into those reactions that we call fight, flight, or freeze. So that's one thing to be aware of. This whole attachment system is affected by a child being removed from the care of their parent. And the other part to this is just in general. With children, the attachment bond feels safe and secure when a child is certain that they're consistently and unconditionally loved, even if they make a mistake or upset their caregiver. Now, of course, no parent is perfect that we can make our child feel consistently loved all the time, but it's in general. Sometimes children can be more sensitive, especially if they're in a situation where they have a different caregiver. And deep down, they're unconscious of this, but they'll have a fear that if they displease their caregiver or get in trouble, the danger detection system might perceive this as a threat to completely losing their caregiver's love. So if you do something to displease them, they're not going to love you anymore. They're not going to be there to take care of you. So the danger detective system kind of sets off a false alarm that, oh my goodness, if I get in trouble or I do something to displease my caregiver. Now, and this stuff is very unconscious. You're not aware of these thoughts. So this can sometimes, when we see kids who are about to get in trouble or who think they've done something to displease their parent or their caregiver, they can go into an unwarranted fight, flight, or freeze response. And I say unwarranted because they're not actually in a dangerous situation, but the brain thinks of it as a dangerous situation. So just to look at that, how would that look? So, the brain was designed to protect you from absolute life and death situations. But if you're getting these false alarms and attachment fears setting off that danger detection system, it can look a little different than what we were meant to do in these actual, back when we were, living in the wild. So for the fight response, what you can see is, other than getting physical, also what the young person or even adults can get into this. You get on the defensive, you're arguing, you're swearing, you're blaming, you're saying hateful things. And this is part of the fight response. Now, the next response, the flight response, that's where you kind of want to run away from the danger. So if a child's in that flight response, they can run out of the room, they can avoid talking about things, they might make excuses not to do things, lie about doing things, avoiding talking about things. So there's that sort of avoidance pattern that looks like it's not necessarily physically running away, it's also mentally running away. And then there's that freeze response, where a child can completely shut down, refuse to act. It can look like procrastination, but they're stuck, they're frozen, because that's what their brain's telling them to do. And it's not conscious, they're not planning to do this. So you could see how many of these behaviors look like a disobedient behavior or a disrespectful behavior. So just keeping in mind when you're looking at, the grandchild's emotional responses, you could see how when you've got all these other things going on, you're going to have a lot of deep feelings and a lot of unconscious behaviors. And in fact, in children, a lot of times their brain isn't developed enough so they can talk about their feelings. So a lot of the stuff comes out as behaviors as opposed to, oh, I'm feeling sad today or I'm feeling angry. So when we start looking at that, children have a lot to be angry about and maybe resentful about because their whole world's been turned upside down. They can be angry at their parent. They can be angry at themselves because a lot of times the way the kid's brain operates is that when they're young, they feel that they're to blame for things that happen in their environment. So they would be angry at themselves for causing their parent to leave. They might be angry at their friends who aren't different like them, who aren't being raised by their grandparent. They can get angry towards agencies and their staff, including, child welfare agencies, but also where you're going to get mental health care, because it can feel like they're intruding and making decisions for grandparents and themselves that can make you feel very angry. And they can even have unconscious anger towards their grandparents because in their mind, again, this is very unconscious, but in their mind, deep down unconsciously, the grandparent took them away from their parents. So there's a lot of anger and resentment that can be brewing away underneath there. And there's a lot of, as we talked about with grandparents, everyone's grieving for losses. And for children, it's not just the loss of their parents' involvement in their life, It's their special relationship they had with you, because when you're a grandparent, it's a different relationship, right? So now you're in a different role, and that can cause sadness and grief. Not only that, they oftentimes are removed from their home, that maybe change schools, they can't see their friends, so there's lots to grieve over. Again, there's a lot of fears and what ifs. So, and a lot of that's self-evident. What if my parent never comes back, never sees me? What if my grandparent gets sick and can't look after me? What if I tell the truth to another adult and it gets my grandparent or my parent in trouble and they're going to take me into foster care? The other fear is, what if I turn out like my parent? What if my friends don't like me now because I'm different? And of course, if a child's been abused or traumatized, these fears will be magnified, even including things like fears about visiting with their parents. So there's a lot of fear underneath these behaviors you might see in your grandchild. And all the confusion as well. You know, some of it is, can I be mad at my parent and still love them so much? Like, how can I be mad? My parents done these things, I can be mad at them, but I still love them, want to live with them. And in a child's brain, that's hard to sort of hold those two things in their brain at the same time. Sometimes kids aren't really told what's going on, and they might hear some little details here and there, and that makes them quite confused, because kids will fill in the blanks with their imagination. And so that can be very confusing. And also, sometimes kids want to talk about what happened, but they feel like there's a taboo. You're not supposed to talk about what happened. And sometimes there's that sort of mixed feeling. I want to see my parent for a visit, but I'm afraid. And when parents make promises they can't keep about visits or presents or those things, that can be very confusing for the grandchild. And they also have the guilt and shame. So that sort of basic idea, my parent never would have left me unless I did something really wrong or something's really bad about me. Like, why would they just leave me like that? And so there's almost always self-blame, particularly when they're very young. And that can lead to a lot of feelings of shame about being really defective. The brain doesn't like those feelings of shame. It really, really does not like those feelings. So sometimes the brain will trick us by distracting us from the shame by using other feelings that are more acceptable, like anger. But that shame can lead to avoiding friends. And of course, if a child's been abused, it's going to be worse. So there's a lot of this guilt and shame going on. Grandchildren and grandparents have similar types of feelings. They might have different reasons for them, but so you can see how much is going on when you're trying to interact with this grandparent with all these feelings, the grandchild with all these feelings. And the fact that children use what I call behavior language. They don't always use words to express their emotions. And there's we all have different temperaments, different ways of being. So some of us tend to be more externalizers, which means we tend to fight and lash out and argue and blame others. Whereas others, we call them internalizers. They tend to blame themselves, withdraw, hold things in, maybe push you away. So, you know, what I'm trying to say here is that everyone can express this. You can have any number of these emotions. They can be expressed in many different ways, many different behaviors on the side of the grandparent and the grandchild. When we're on an airplane, they tell us when the oxygen mask drops down, you put it on yourself first before you put it on your child, because you cannot help your child or your grandchild if you're not well. So self-care, not self-neglect. And I know it's easier said than done when I say this, absolutely. And so one of the ways, you know, the studies that they've done have shown that one of the best ways we can care for ourselves in this situation as a grandparent raising a grandchild is to reach out for support. That's a proven protective factor for your mental health and your grandchild's mental health. So reaching out for support and accepting support. Again, this is easier said than done. Self-compassion, understanding you're doing the best you can in this situation. Nobody's perfect. This is a very difficult situation. As I just showed you, there's a lot of emotions going on here. And the other part to it is checking your expectations. And what I mean by that is, sometimes when we have a lot of guilt or shame about what's happened in the past, we want to make things up. So for instance, there might be you're carrying around this baggage that, oh my goodness, I raised the parent and this is what they turned out like. And now I need to make up for what went wrong. So I've got to fix all of this. And I have to protect my grandchild from any possible distress now that, you know, I've saved them from the situation. But here's the thing. Again, you can do the best that you can. And all of us, I believe we do the best we can with what we've been given in the situation we're in. And so this is where we sometimes have to understand when we find ourselves getting fierce about things, maybe understand, why am I getting so fierce about this, and what is getting to me? And sometimes underneath it is that expectation of fixing what in your mind you blame yourself for. And I'm not saying you should blame yourself for that. I'm saying that's human nature. This is what happens. And of course, you need to monitor your mental health and seek help if needed, but also don't neglect your physical health, because studies have shown that grandparents in this situation will often neglect going to their doctor's appointments, refilling their medications. Sometimes there's financial issues, there's time issues, but it's something to be really aware of. And obviously, again, how do we find the time for this? But having some type of hobby, some type of social interactions, and having breaks. You cannot be 24/7 caregiving your grandchild. And things like homework, you might need to ask the teacher for help with the homework, because again, there's a generation gap. It's been a long time since you went to school, and there's no harm in asking for help. So there have been a few studies where they designed some special ways of trying to help grandparents when they're in this situation. And one group of sort of cluster of helping interventions are parent management skills training, which would be something like triple P parenting, which is where you get sort of a refresher on managing difficult behaviors. And as you can see, as I've discussed, you know, this is going to be a situation where you can expect more behavior issues and more emotional issues. It goes without saying. And so you might need advanced skills other than what you already have to sort of manage some of these. So it's not just getting a refresher, but sort of learning some other techniques for dealing with these behaviors, which you may never have had to deal with in your previous parenting experience. So in our community, we have triple P parenting. Now, in these studies, it was a special sort of triple P parenting designed just for grandparents, but you know, we don't really have that. But again, this could possibly mean that having just going for triple P parenting may at least give you a boost in that area. But the interesting thing is that they also showed that when grandparents get cognitive behavior therapy for themselves, that helps them to get through all these emotional reactions to be able to do self-help and help seeking, because sometimes our emotions get in the way of us asking for help or accepting help. So those two groups of interventions did show some important effects on not only the mental health of the grandparents, but also the well-being of the child, the grandchild. So we've talked first about helping yourself, because that's, to me, the most important. And secondly is helping your grandchild. And a lot of these are self-explanatory, and you've probably heard them before, but providing comfort, support, and nurturing. Really important to keep predictability and schedules. Sometimes we want to spoil people and we want to, you know, make things special, but kids don't feel safe when there's not loving boundaries around them. They need that sort of support of knowing what's coming. And that's true for any child, of course. And having a time of day, maybe before bed or after school, where you check in and see how they're feeling, but not forcing kids to talk about feelings. That can feel intrusive, but just letting them know you're there to listen and that it's okay to talk about feelings. Now, the studies have shown that children do better when they're removed from the care of their parents if they have healthy, safe contact with their parents. Now, that isn't always possible, so I'm not saying that you should do that if it seems like an unhealthy or unsafe thing to do, but where possible, that does lead to better outcomes. And another thing Kids who have been through this have a lot of trouble with trust. They may feel very different from their other kids their own age, and they actually have problems with social skills. So in order to help them, we need to promote situations where they're going to have experience dealing with being in social groups, things like cadets and brownies and beavers and those kinds of things. And if you can, arranging play dates. So this is a very important part of development, social skills, and very important part of making, as we know, we feel better when we're socializing, and we need to help our grandkids with that. And of course, if you have concerns about their mental health, to seek help for that. So those are kind of general things. But I just wanted to point out to you that they've done studies. Now, this is with grandmothers. That's not to say it might not be the same for grandfathers, but they've shown that when there's a close bond or close relationship between grandmothers and a grandchild, in these situations where the primary caregiver, that close bond leads to an improved mental health in the grandmother and also decreased behavior problems in their grandchild. So any way we can try to support that bond, that relationship, that's really important. And I understand this is sometimes easier said than done, but that is just something to keep in the back of your mind, that that relationship is very important. So this is a lot of words on this slide, and I apologize for that. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that there's some things that we should try to avoid doing, because those are things that feed into either shutting down the expression of emotions, or they feed into those emotions that I've listed before. And I think another thing to understand is that this is why I wanted to spend all that time talking about these emotional reactions, so that when you see them in your grandchild, you can try to take a step back and not take it personally. If you can understand, hey, they're having shame, I'm having shame too. It comes out in different ways, but we're all in the same boat with this. Because when we take things personally, we're already in a difficult place as a grandparent, and we don't need to add to that burden. So similarly, we shouldn't say things to make the child feel responsible for your own feelings. So, because children are like that, they do worry about hurting you. And again, I talked about that attachment relationship. They don't, you're now their caregiver, and they don't want to have you get mad at them and not be there for them. And in their brain, sometimes there's that worry you're gonna leave them. So also, it's, if you can, it's much better to talk about their parent than to make it a taboo subject. And similarly, not bad-mouthing the parent, not keeping secrets or lying, or venting or sharing adult information, because they're children and their brains, they're still a child and they can't manage these types of things. And another thing that sometimes happens is that, the oldest child, we say, well, now it's your responsibility to look after your brother and sisters. Well, I think responsibility is a big word. I think that we should promote the bond between siblings. It certainly helps, but you don't want to put that kind of responsibility on them, or saying things to them that might increase their sense of shame, like, look how you made me feel, I've sacrificed so much for you. And similarly, you don't want to feed into their fear of turning out like their parent if they've seen behaviors in their parent that are kind of scary for them. So sometimes I know that there's that fear that grandparents have, oh my goodness, I'm seeing the same behavior in my grandchild that I saw in my child. Maybe they're going to turn out the same. And this is something you need to be aware of and be careful about how you can, might blurt that out in front of your grandchild. So those are sort of the things, these things can lead to more of those emotions I talked to, and fear, and increase those fears of losing that attachment with you, who's now their caregiver. And again, I talked before about things like accepting support, accepting or practicing self-care, but you can be a role model for your grandchild that it's okay to do self-care and to express emotions. And give permission to talk about their parent and to continue to love them no matter what they've done. Normalizing it's okay to still love your parent, because they have that initial attachment bond I talked about when they're a newborn, and that bond is always going to be there no matter what. And that's hard sometimes to see, but that's the reality. Also, going back to what I said, how children often blame themselves, reassuring your grandchild they're not responsible for what happened. I mentioned putting yourself in their shoes. Again, understanding they're also having the same kinds of emotional reactions you are, and that can help you to kind of step back. And when you do get it wrong, it's okay to apologize. And if you don't know something, it's better to say you don't know than to make something up. Communication, open communication, honesty is always better. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some hot topics when it comes to caregiving your grandchild. And I think one of them is, how do you possibly maintain that relationship with your grandchild's parent? Now, I'm saying this is the ideal. If you can do this, it's best for the child. And it's also, studies have shown that when there's a lot of problems in the relationship between a grandparent and the parent, that's associated with greater behavior problems and school difficulties in the grandchild. So this sort of tells you that, we all instinctively kind of know that, but studies have proved that. So, as much as you can, encouraging some form of co-parenting when that's possible. I talk a little bit here about making a care plan with the parent, and that is not always possible. What care plan is sort of, I've included it. If some of you want to get a copy of my slides, I've included it. There's a website that has some excellent resources in that department, but a care plan is sort of making sure you have a list of all their doctors, their appointments, their activities, emergency contacts, school contacts. So everybody shares the same information while still making your roles very clear. And that can be very difficult. And not to say this is easy, and having, communicating rules and expectations for consistency. And I know, sometimes parents have mental health problems, they have addictions problems, they have things that make it difficult for them to do that. And I understand that that can be a very difficult thing, but if we can try the best we can with that, that can be helpful. Making sure that if you can share the caregiver roles with the parent or someone else, that allows breaks for you. And again, it's that idea of putting yourself in the shoes of your child. We talked about the grieving and loss you have yourself for the changes in roles. And your adult child has lost their role as a caregiver, and they are grieving themselves. So if you can make them feel a part of their child's life, sharing the child's schedule, their school progress, school photos, those kinds of things can be very helpful. If we can do that, it's very helpful. Now, I'm just aware of the time because we started a little late. So at the time when you're transitioning the child into your home, it's important they have a special area for themselves. Now, sometimes it's not possible for them to have an entire room to themselves, but if they have a corner set up with their special toys and a blanket and pillows, something that they can feel is their own special place. We all need that. And encourage their input into that little special place, or input into planning meals, deciding on what chores they're going to do. As much as you can, if there were routines and schedules that were working in their home before, you carry on those same routines and scheduling. Now, that might not be possible. But the other thing I want to remind you is when you were in the role as grandparent, you may have had some special little rituals or special things you did together with your grandchild that maybe keep some of those, well, not maybe, you should keep some of those up. I know it's confusing that you're in the parenting role, but to know that special bond is still there can be, remember I showed you that slide that special bond between grandmothers and their grandchildren can improve the situation. So that's something to keep up. And I also wanted to speak about the idea of this sort of honeymoon period, and that with any change, there might be really good behavior for a bit, and then the child might start acting out. And that's pretty normal. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that acting out behaviors can sometimes mean that your grandchild feels safe enough in this environment with you that they can show all of their feelings. Sometimes they're holding it in all day at school, and the only place they can let it out is at home. And sometimes that can actually be a good sign that your grandchild is feeling comfortable and safe to be vulnerable in front of you. The reason I talked about all these different emotions is it's important to think about accepting any emotions during this transition time without judgment, communicating openly, and again, that having that care plan. And it mentions there the website for that, but it's also, if we get a copy of my slides, it's also in that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on visits with parents, but if they are having visits with parents, obviously they should be planned in advance, not, short notice, a regular schedule of visits, again, if possible. Everyone needs to understand the expectations for this visit ahead of time. Try to maintain consistent rules in your home and during the visits as much as we can. It's good for the child to have a safety plan, to know what to do if things aren't working out, who to call. Before and after, you can normalize with your grandchild that it's okay to have a lot of these different emotions about it. You can have positive ones, you can have negative ones, and that's okay. I read somewhere about a recommendation that you have the grandchild bring what you might call show and tell. So in between visits with the parents, gathering some schoolwork, some artwork they've done, just to share maybe some pictures they've taken, just to share. So there's a topic of conversation. Sometimes grandchildren can feel uncomfortable. What are we going to talk about? And the parent can feel uncomfortable. So that's just an idea that might be helpful. So I wanted to spend a little more time. I've got a few minutes to talk about this because I think this is a topic that's really difficult. So the topic is talking to your grandchild about their parents. So, and what I mean by that is what happened to their parent that caused them to have to come and live with you now. So it's important before you even think about talking about this, that you have enough of an understanding, if possible, a little bit of a talk about what do they already know and how do they feel about their parent. But before you go and tell them what actually happened, it's very important to, what I've said, called prepare a script. So rather than just saying something off the cuff, it can be very important to actually plan out what you're going to say. And also important is finding the appropriate time to say it. There's times when kids don't want to talk and you can't really pressure them to. And in fact, it takes a lot of courage for their child to talk about their parent. It's a really scary topic for them. So finding the right time, and as you say the script to them, observing their response and sharing your own emotional reactions about the situation, again, in an appropriate way, not bad-mouthing parent, not shaming, and also normalizing that loving their parent, no matter what they did, is okay. Because this is a really big source of confusion for kids. You can encourage them to ask questions after you've sort of said your script. And if they don't want to talk right then after you've talked about it, that's fine. You tell them you can ask questions anytime. And if there comes a time that your grandchild asks you a question and you really don't have time at that moment, make a plan for exactly when you're going to talk about it. Don't just put it off, we'll do it later. Make a time. We're going to talk about it after school tomorrow, or we're going to talk about it before bed tonight. And again, sort of have that script in your head so you can repeat it as needed, or as requested rather, but to think about the fact you might have to modify it, what you're telling them, as the child matures, because they can understand things in a different way as they mature. So if you can take anything out of this, it's kind of the idea of being prepared. So that can include what I mentioned before, is identifying gaps or misunderstandings in your grandchild's knowledge about what happened. But I think the other really important thing is to arm yourself with reliable facts about their parent's condition. So if the parent has a mental illness, for instance, there are resources. I've put one website there, but there are many resources to learn about what symptoms and behaviors you might see in someone with that diagnosis. Similarly, things like addiction. Addiction is an illness, not a moral choice. It's helpful for you to understand this before you talk to your grandchild. And things like mental illness can come, like a person can have a single episode of a mental illness, but it can also repeat. You have one episode that resolves, it can come back. Sometimes it really never goes away. So understanding, because if you say, oh, your mommy got sick and she's going to get all better and it's going to be fine, that might not be actually what's going to happen if they have a chronic disease like, say, schizophrenia, or they've had a head injury, or they have a physical disorder that makes it difficult for them. So if you need to have the facts yourself. And it goes without saying, when you do tell the story, you want to use language they can understand, and avoid scary words. Like things like addiction might be a big word for a little kid, or abuse or neglect. And whatever you tell them, you need to be aware that they might say your words to their parent or to other adults or other people. So that's why, you need to plan this out so you have the right words to use. And the focus should be on forgiveness, not blame toward their parents. So the idea, well, mom is a good person who made a mistake. It's okay to forgive her, even if what she did was wrong, because kids have trouble with that concept. If someone's bad, I can't like them. If they're good, I can like them. That's a concept we need to help them to understand. Again, reassuring them that they didn't do something to cause what happened in their parent. Give permission to have a full range of emotions in response. And that's why it's important to understand all those different emotions. To normalize that it's okay to be mad at dad and still love him. And to share feelings, show how you might have similar feelings. Again, that's why I talked about those, how we share, both groups share similar feelings. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Now, I went online and I've included this website where I found them, but these are some words, and this is just an example, and you don't have to agree, this might not work for you, but this, like, say if you have a younger child and mom's got an addiction. So the way they wrote this on this particular website was, there are things that can make mummies really sick, and sometimes mummies need to go to someone to help them to learn how to make better decisions about what to put in their bodies. So while mommy is learning and getting help, you're staying with me. You can add things like, it's not your fault this happened. We can help her by loving her lots. And if you're spiritual or religious, by saying prayers. The idea, like if the parent is in jail, for a younger child, you can say things like, how our house has rules. Some rules are so important, they are called laws, and everyone has to follow them, even grown-ups. When someone breaks a law, they have to go away to do timeout. You might not want to use those words, but to learn how to behave. And so you are staying with us until daddy is out of timeout. For an older kid, you can be more clear. Your dad broke the law by stealing. The judge decided he needs to go to jail to think about what he's done, and he's going to be there for a while. And while he's there, we'll take care of you. For things like neglect, again, this is more for a slightly older child, but some parents need help getting a job and making the right choices before they can care for their child again. So while they're learning, the child stays with a family who's already learned to do those things, and that's why you're staying with us. So these are just some examples of words to use. Now, I kind of presented a lot of information in a very short period of time, but I think if you could walk away with anything, I think the idea, if you don't have to remember all the emotions, but understanding that you might have a lot of negative feelings, as might your grandchild. You should not judge yourselves for having that, and that can be a common bond between the two of you, that you share similar emotional responses. And that the other thing is that putting your everything into caring for your grandchild without doing any self-care can be harmful. And you need to be kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself. And another piece that really in the study showed that helped grandparents in this situation was asking for and accepting support. And that can be very hard. And remember, I told you that having some cognitive behavior therapy supports for the grandparent could help them when they struggled with doing that. And much as it's difficult maintaining a connection with your grandchild's parent and promoting that connection with their child, I read a statement somewhere that made sense to me, that it's easier to maintain than rebuild a relationship. And that kind of made sense to me. And the other idea is preparing ahead of time, talk to your grandchild about their parent, and seeking mental health supports for yourself and or your grandchild if needed. So again, I've talked to you about a lot of things and maybe put too much into one talk, but I think that's really what I'd like you to come away from this with. So I just want to thank everybody for coming and listening to this talk. It's sort of a broad topic. I tried my best to pick out the parts that I thought were most important. So thank you, everybody.